Miracle in the Andes, an incredible story of survival and courage. My name is Roberto, and what I'm going to tell you is something that haunts every second of my life. I was only 20 years old when it all happened. He was part of a rugby team at the Uruguayan high school Stella Maris, and we were on our way to Chile for a match. We were young, full of hope and energy. The plane ride was just another detail in our carefree lives, until it wasn't. Life changed in the blink of an eye. The Fairchild FH227 seemed safe, but as we flew over the Andes, things began to change. First, there were the turbulence. The plane was shaking so that the tight seatbelts didn't seem to be enough to hold us back. The nervous laughter soon turned into a heavy silence. Outside, the previously clear sky was thick with dense clouds. The snow-capped mountains below us seemed immense, threatening. I felt small, insignificant in front of that white expanse. Suddenly everything happened too fast. I heard a crash, a dry sound, as if something had broken. The plane shook violently. Someone's scream cut through the air, and within seconds, chaos ensued. The lights flickered, oxygen masks dropped over our heads, but there was no time to react. Next thing I knew, we were falling. The noise of engines failing was deafening. The panic was absolute. I held on to my seat with all my might, my heart racing in my chest. I looked at my friends and saw the same terror on their faces that I felt. The plane was breaking up. I felt the crushing force against my body when the impact came. The fuselage shattered around us. It was impossible to distinguish between physical pain and overwhelming fear. It felt like time had stopped, but the shock, the noise, the feeling of being thrown through the air were all too real. When I opened my eyes, for a moment, I believed I was dead. Everything was white. Snow covered my face. My body was half buried in ice. The first thing I felt was the cold, a cold that cut to the bone, that stole my breath. I tried to move, but my body wasn't responding properly. All around, pieces of the plane were scattered everywhere. The fuselage, the roof, the seats, everything destroyed, dismantled. I heard moaning. I looked to the side and saw a friend, his face covered in blood, barely breathing. I didn't know if he was alive or dead. Around me, other bodies lay motionless, inert. Some still had their eyes open, but they were dead. The metallic smell of blood and fuel mingled with the freezing air. I couldn't understand what was happening. It was like being trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I stood up with difficulty, my legs shaking. The thin, freezing air made breathing difficult. My head hurt, and there were deep cuts on my arms and face. I heard screams and wails, people calling for help, but we knew no one would come. I looked around, trying to spot more survivors. I saw some of us getting up, others struggling to get out of the wreckage. And then reality began to set in my mind. We were completely lost, in the middle of the Andes Mountains, with no sign of help. One of the first to approach me was Nando. He was covered in snow and his face was disfigured. But, incredibly, he was still breathing. He looked at me with wide eyes, saying nothing. We didn't need words. What was happening around us was incomprehensible. One of the engines was still on fire a few meters away, and the heat from the flames was melting the snow around it, but we knew that heat was temporary. The cold would come to consume us. We actually managed to stand. I realized the extent of the disaster. The plane's tail was broken. Part of the cabin was gone, probably washed down the mount. I knew that many of our friends had been thrown out during the fall. I started walking, stumbling through the deep snow, until I came across a group of survivors trying to help the injured. I saw Fido's face, pale as snow, as he pressed a bloody handkerchief to the chest of another friend who was struggling to breathe. We couldn't help. There were no doctors, there were no medicines. The next few minutes were a mixture of dread and despair. We tried to gather everyone who was still alive. The pilot had died instantly, and part of the crew too. The silence that followed after the initial shock was devastating. Only the biting wind from the mountains and the distant sound of the engine still burning filled the void. I looked up at the sky, trying to convince myself that someone, somewhere, knew what had happened. But as time passed, the reality that we were completely alone became clearer. The first night went down quickly. The sun hid behind the mountains and the temperature plummeted. We were not prepared for that cold, for that relentless darkness. The clothes we wore were not enough to protect us from the ice. We knew we couldn't stay there. We needed to find shelter, something that would keep us alive until dawn. Little by little, what was left of our energy began to drain away, and the fight for survival turned into a continuous nightmare. That was just the first of the long nights that were yet to come. The cold of the first night in the Andes was not just a physical sensation, but something that penetrated the soul. That infinite darkness, the death all around us, the thin air, and the constant fear that every breath could be our last. I felt surrounded by a deafening silence, only interrupted by the groans of those still fighting to live. The heat from our huddled bodies was the only thing keeping us breathing, but even that felt like a losing battle. When the sun finally began to rise above the horizon, bringing a faint, almost cruel light, it was like a temporary relief. My eyes were swollen from crying and fighting the biting wind that scratched my face. I couldn't feel my feet or my hands anymore. Snow entered every opening in my clothes, and the cold seemed to slowly suck the life out of me. I can't say if I slept that night, or if it was just a fever of despair and pain that led me to a kind of torpor. The first sound I heard when the day broke was the soft cry of a friend. I turned with difficulty, my muscles hard as stone, and saw Nando beside me, tears frozen on his face, mixing with the dried blood. He said nothing, just stared into space, the glassy eyes of someone who had not yet absorbed the horror of everything that had happened. All around us, the scene was devastating. The plane looked like a wrecked carcass, an enormous tombstone embedded in the middle of an endless plain of snow. Parts of the aircraft's body were scattered around like broken toes. Bodies, some of which I had known since childhood, were lying in the snow, their faces frozen in expressions of terror, their limbs rigid and contorted in positions that should not have been possible. What were once friends have now become cold and inert statues, silent witnesses of the catastrophe. Some of us, those who could still move, tried to count the survivors. Fito, who seemed to have assumed a natural leadership role, trudged through the snow, calling out the names of those still alive. That's when we realized that some people who survived the fall died during the night, consumed by the cold, fear, or injuries they couldn't bear. Death was everywhere, and the feeling of helplessness began to dominate us. We had no idea where we were, how long it would take for someone to find us, if they found us at all. As we watched the endless white horizon, the hope of immediate rescue began to seem more and more remote. Hunger began to show signs. It wasn't just an empty feeling in the stomach, but a slow ache, an internal burning that reminded us, every minute, that our time was running out. We had found some chocolate bars and bottles of wine in the wreckage, but it was little, almost nothing. We divided what was left meticulously, each receiving a small portion, as if that could sustain us longer. But we knew deep down that this was just a temporary distraction. The air was thin, and the altitude made everything more difficult. Every step felt like a marathon, every breath a struggle. We tried to improvise shelters with pieces of the plane's fuselage, dragging what we could to form a kind of temporary hut, but we didn't have the resources to face the extreme cold. Snow was everywhere, blinding our eyes and freezing our bodies. I felt trapped in an icy prison without walls, where time seemed to have stopped. Looking at the horizon, I realized that imposing and majestic landscape of the Andes, which had previously seemed so beautiful to me from up there, was now a silent enemy. Those mountains had no mercy, there was no life, there was no sound, just the oppressive silence of the snow and the wind. And we, small figures lost in the middle of that white desert. That morning, as the sun slowly rose, we began digging trenches in the snow. It was not to shelter us, but to bury our dead. There was no way to carry them, and we knew we couldn't leave them exposed to the cold. Every shovelful of snow we removed was a reminder of the fragility of life, and with every body we laid in those makeshift graves, a piece of our hope died as well. By noon, I no longer felt time. The cold had consumed almost all my energy. The thought that we might never be rescued slowly crept into our minds. Conversations were few. The looks between us said more than any words. Desperation surrounded us like a lurking predator, waiting for the right moment to attack us. At some point, someone mentioned the possibility of trying to climb the mountains for help. The idea seemed absurd. We were weak, malnourished, barely able to walk. How could we climb those gigantic ice walls? The despair was already beginning to turn into madness. The expectation of survival was minimal, and every minute that passed without a plane appearing in the sky brought us closer to the certainty that we would not get out of there alive. That night would be even worse. We knew that, with less food and more cold, there would be no other option but to face the worst-case scenario. And as the sun began to disappear behind the mountains again, a dark thought began to hover over us. How would we survive the hunger and cold in the coming days? The third morning in the Andes started differently. It wasn't just the biting cold that was plaguing us, but a growing sense of despair that was now eating us up inside. My thoughts were heavy, as if my mind was trapped in the same ice that covered the landscape around us. The hunger, which at first was just a pang in the stomach, had now become an unbearable, constant pain. I could feel my body weakening with each hour that passed without food, and despair gripped us all. I was sitting next to Nando, who was staring at the horizon with empty eyes. He looked as frail as I did, with his face pale and his lips chapped from the cold. We looked at each other, but there were no more words. The conversations had stopped. The energy required to speak was more than we could bear at that moment. Only the sound of the wind whistling in the mountains and the groans of the injured broke the silence. "No one will find us, Roberto," said Canessa, approaching with a firm gaze, but with a deep sadness that betrayed him. "We are very far from any flight path." Those words echoed in my mind like a funeral bell. I knew he was right. It had been days since the fall, and there was no sign of rescue. Canessa was one of the most rational among us, someone I admired for her strength and clarity of thought, but hearing that from his mouth was like admitting what we all already knew, but were afraid to say out loud. We were alone, completely at the mercy of nature, of death. We started discussing what we would do next. Some desperate attempts to get out of there had already been made, but climbing those immense mountains was impossible without food, without strength. We were trapped in that icy valley. The injured grew worse every day, and the intense cold stole the lives of those who could not move. Time passed cruelly. Hunger became the center of everything. Our bodies were exhausted, burning the last reserves of energy. The small portions of chocolate and wine we had found on the plain were nothing more than memories now. The pain of hunger grew, becoming a constant presence, an invisible knife that ripped through our insides. It was then that, for the first time, someone brought the unthinkable to light. "We need to do something," said Fido, his voice shaking, not just from the cold, but from terror at what he was about to suggest. He was looking at the ground, unable to look at us. "If we don't, we're all going to die here." We all knew what he was talking about. And the weight of that idea fell on us like an avalanche. The air around us seemed to freeze even more. There was no immediate response, and unsettling silence dominated the group. I looked around and saw the fear, the disgust, the shock on the faces of others. But I also saw something else. I saw hunger, the same hunger I felt. She was destroying us from within, slowly and cruelly. Nando, beside me, remained silent, his face hardened. He was one of the strongest among us, but I could see in his eyes that he also understood what was being suggested. What we did next would haunt us forever, but the truth was we had no choice. Hunger transformed us, took us to the limits of what was human. The cold and death around us left us no choice. It was then that, in an almost inaudible whisper, Canessa, the same man who had maintained rationality until now, who seemed to be the anchor for us all, said, "We have to survive. It's either that or we all die." The words were harsh, but true. We stood there, staring at the ground, as if we didn't want to see what we knew we needed to do. The bodies of our friends were there, frozen, preserved by the cold. They died before us, and now, in a way, they offered us the only chance to stay alive. The first time was the hardest. The sound of the knife cutting through the frozen meat was grotesque, something I will never forget. I felt my stomach turn, and for a moment, I thought I was going to vomit right then and there. But there was nothing in my body to expel. My hands were shaking as I held that piece of cold meat, and the shock of being there, doing that, left me paralyzed for a few seconds. When Ashley brought the piece to my mouth, the taste was unlike anything I had ever tasted. It wasn't just the taste of raw meat, but the weight of the choice, the weight of the sacrifice. I felt like, with each bite, a part of me was dying. A part of my humanity was slipping away. But the hunger was greater than anything else. We needed to live, we had to survive. The bitter taste of the meat mixed with the bitterness of our souls. Around me, others did the same, some silently, others crying as they chewed. horrified by what they were doing but with no other option. That act, which seemed like the height of despair, did not bring immediate relief. It only brought the certainty that we had crossed a line from which we could no longer return. I was alive, but at what cost? The following hours were marked by an even greater feeling of emptiness. It wasn't just the cold or hunger, but a new reality that enveloped us. Now, we were survivors of something that defied all limits. From that moment on, we were no longer just victims of an accident. We became something more, something we could never erase from our minds. Night fell again, and the cold returned, as relentless as ever. But somehow we felt a small spark of strength. The act we feared so much gave us another day, another chance. And so, we survived, at least for now. The next night was longer than all the previous ones. It wasn't just the cold that made it unbearable, something inside me had changed. I could no longer close my eyes without being tormented by the images of what we had done. And the weight of the act still hung over us, like a shadow that would never leave us. That meat we had eaten, which should have been our salvation, now repulsed me, and yet, it was the only reason we were still alive. Nando, next to me, was silent, like everyone else. We had crossed an invisible barrier, a moral boundary that had previously seemed insurmountable. Now, our reality was different, shaped by the brutal need to keep breathing, to move forward every minute, every second, as if that, in some way, could redeem us. I never imagined it would be like this, Nando murmured, his voice almost swallowed by the cold wind that whistled between the mountains. I never thought it would get to this point. I shook my head, unable to respond. What could we say? That everything would be different when we were out of there. That we would someday forget. There were no easy answers, no comfort. What we had done could not be undone, and it was engraved in our souls. The cold was even stronger that night. It felt like the wind was punishing us for our sin, but we knew it was nature doing what it always does, testing its limits, challenging us to hold on a little longer. It was always another night, survive once again, one small step at a time, without knowing how long it would take us to be found. Hope, which once moved us, now seemed more distant, almost unattainable. The next morning, Canessa approached me with a heavy look, her eyes sunken and her expression hardened by the conditions and the choices we had made. He still maintained a strong stance, but I could see from his gestures that he was also on edge. We need to think about what we're going to do. Roberto, he said, his voice hoarse. We can't go on like this forever. The food won't last. We have to find a solution. What he said was true. Even after resorting to the unthinkable, we knew it wouldn't be enough to keep us alive for long. The human body needs more than that, and conditions were not improving. On the contrary, it seemed that every day the temperature dropped a little more, and snow accumulated on the plane wreckage, turning our makeshift shelter into an ice cave. We're going to die if we stay here, I reply, my voice shaking with cold and despair. No one will find us, Canessa nodded. He knew this as much as I did, and yet, the idea of leaving there, of climbing those mountains in search of help, seemed crazy. How could we, in our state, face the immensity of the Andes? Many had already suggested this, but we always came back to the same point. We were too weak. We could barely move. Any attempt would be suicide. Still, something needed to be done. Nando and Fido joined us, forming a small discussion circle. It was the first time in days that we talked openly about the possibility of a plan. Hopelessness had paralyzed us until then, but now, after what we had been through, it seemed like we needed to make a decision, any decision, or we would be consumed by inaction. We need to try, said Nando, with a renewed strength that surprised me. He was decided. If we stay here, it's only a matter of time. We are dying slowly. His eyes met mine, and I saw something new there. It wasn't just hunger or desperation, but fierce determination. He was willing to go beyond what any of us thought possible. We knew the decision was risky, but we had no alternatives. The choice was clear. Either we tried to seek help, or we waited for death, whether from hunger, from the cold, or from another night that would take some more of us. We spent the day discussing the details of what would be our last chance. Canessa, always practical, began to gather the few resources we still had. The plan was simple, but terrifying. Nando and Canessa would go in search of help. They would try to climb the nearest mountains and see if they could find a point high enough to see any signs of civilization. We would remain the others, awaiting any sign of success. The idea of being left behind terrified me. I knew that once they left, everyone's chances of survival would decrease even further, that there was no alternative. Nando and Canessa are the strongest physically. If anyone had a chance of crossing the mountains, it was them. The rest of us were too weakened to even try. When night fell again, the mood was heavier than ever. There was tension in the air, a mix of fear and hope. The other survivors were quiet, all aware that we were approaching the point of no return. Tomorrow, Nando and Canessa would leave. And with them, they would take our last hopes. I lay down on that cold piece of metal that we use as a shelter and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. My body ached, but my mind was in a whirlwind of thoughts. I wondered if this would be the last time I would see my friends. Could they? Or would it be just another failed attempt that would lead to the end? As much as I tried to shake the darkness from my thoughts, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were saying goodbye. That night I dreamed of home. I dreamed of the heat of Uruguay, of my mother waiting for me at the door, of sunny days, of carefree laughter. And when I woke up to the sound of the wind cutting through the mountains, I remember how far away it all was now. Dawn came, and as the sun slowly rose over the mountains, Nando and Canessa prepared to leave. We knew that if they didn't come back, the end was near. It was our last bet, and luck didn't seem to be in our favor. We woke up before the sun rose. The cold was still unbearable, and the wind howled through the wreckage like a living presence, reminding us that time was running out. I watched Nando and Canessa, who were getting ready to leave. They gathered what little we had, pieces of torn blankets, pieces of metal that they would use as makeshift utensils, and the invisible hope that still remained in our hearts. The thought of seeing them leave was distressing, but we knew this was our only chance. Canessa, as always, kept a serious look, but there was a tiredness in her movements. He was visibly weakened, although he never complained. Nando, on the other hand, seemed more determined than ever. The one who until a few days ago cried in silence beside me was now our greatest strength. There was a spark in his eyes, something that seemed impossible to extinguish, even in the midst of all that tragedy. "Let's find help," he said, with a confidence that surprised me. I wanted to believe. I needed to believe. As the group gathered around them, the silence between us was thick, filled with a mixture of fear and expectation. Some of the weaker survivors looked at them with admiration, but also with despair. For many, that was the last hope, the last attempt to get out alive. If they failed, what would become of us? "You need to go back," I said, the words coming out with difficulty as my throat was dry and the emotion was suffocating me. "Don't leave us here for too long." Nando nodded. There were no promises, just a silent understanding. He knew that time was against us, and that each day in that icy valley brought us closer to death. They needed to find help, and quickly. Before leaving, Nando came to me, put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You'll make it, Roberto. We all go. We can't give up now." The word sounded more like an order than encouragement, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. We needed to believe this, even if inside we were all exhausted. We said goodbye in silence. Each of us knew that this journey would not be simple, that the treacherous terrain, the altitude, and the cold would be implacable enemies. I saw the two disappear into the white expanse, their figures shrinking until they were nothing more than small dots lost in the snow. The feeling of emptiness that came afterwards was overwhelming. We stood there, looking at the horizon, as if we expected to see them return at any moment. But we knew the reality was different. The journey would be long, and days would pass before we heard anything, if any at all. I returned to our makeshift shelter and sat on the floor, trying to warm my hands. Nobody spoke. We were trapped in our own thoughts, fighting to push away the fear that threatened to consume us. Hunger, once an unbearable pain, was now something constant, a cruel but familiar presence. Our bodies were getting used to her in ways I never imagined possible. The days began to drag on, one after another. The weight was unbearable. Every time the sun set, another day passed, taking part of our hope with it. The wind continued relentlessly, and the snow never stopped. Each new layer that fell on the plain buried us a little more in the vastness of the Andes, as if the mountains were slowly swallowing us with their icy indifference. The group began to weaken even more. Some of us got sick. The bodies of our dead friends, who had once provided us with the fuel to carry on, were now almost completely depleted. It was horrible to admit, but we knew that that resource would also run out soon. Hunger returned with full force, like an insatiable beast that would never stop tormenting us. One night, when the wind was particularly strong, I heard a muffled sob coming from one of the corners of the shelter. It was Fido. He was lying down, with his face hidden in his hands, crying silently. I knew we were all on the verge of breaking down, but seeing Fido, who had always been one of the most resilient, succumb to despair was like feeling a knife go through my chest. "We can't go on like this," he whispered, his voice full of pain and resignation. "There's nothing left to eat, Roberto. We are finished." I didn't know what to answer. What could I say? Would we stay there, waiting for the end? Hunger would consume us. The cold would kill us one by one, until there was no one left. That was the naked reality, and none of us had the strength to deny it. We spent more days waiting for a miracle. Canessa and Nando hadn't returned. The hope that they would find help began to fade. We were too weak to take any other action. There was no more strength to try something new. I wondered if they would ever be able to climb the mountains, or if they had been swallowed by the same unforgiving landscape that now held us prisoner. Little by little, the atmosphere between us changed. The silence was now absolute, broken only by the winds that roared outside. The cold was getting stronger and stronger, and our resistance was running out. Some were already so weak that they could barely stand up. The voices of encouragement, which were once the only comfort we had completely disappeared. At the time, the idea that we could survive without outside help seemed like a cruel fantasy. We knew time was running out. Time in the Andes seemed to never pass, as if we were trapped in a cold and cruel eternity. Days, weeks, there was no way of knowing for sure. The cold had become a constant in our lives, an overwhelming presence that allowed no rest or relief. The wind roared, carrying with it our last remnants of hope, as if it was trying to consume us along with the infinite snow that surrounded us. That morning started like every other morning, but something about me felt different. I was weaker than ever. Every breath was a fight, every movement a battle. My bones ached from the cold that never left us, and my thoughts were slow, numb from extreme tiredness and hunger. I looked around the makeshift shelter, and saw the faces of my companions, pale and haggard, each on the brink of his own ruin. Fido was huddled in a corner, his eyes closed, his lips dry and cracked. He had given up talking. The moans of pain that had previously echoed through the shelter had turned into a deep, almost desperate silence. He no longer had the strength to complain. The same happened with others. We were all slowly fading away, consumed by hunger and cold, like candles being blown out by the merciless wind. It was then that the image of Nando and Canessa came to mind, alone in the mountains. The idea that they were still out there, fighting the impossible, gave me a modicum of comfort, but it also terrified me. Were they dead, or were they as lost as we were, somewhere in the mountains, unable to move forward? The uncertainty was unbearable. I felt the emptiness growing inside me, an emptiness greater than hunger or the cold. As the hours passed, my body seemed to give up little by little. I felt heavier, as if the exhaustion would pull me down, burying me in the snow forever. It was getting difficult to keep my eyes open. My mind wandered between feverish daydreams and lapses of consciousness. Every now and then, I thought I heard voices or laughter, as if I were back in Uruguay, walking through the hot streets of Montevideo. But it was just the wind, always the wind. Just when I thought we wouldn't be able to last another day, an unexpected sound woke me up. It was a different noise, almost imperceptible amid the incessant howling of the wind. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a creation of my tired and delirious mind. But then, others started to notice too. There was something happening outside. One movement. "Did you hear that?" someone murmured in a hoarse voice. Slowly, with great difficulty, we got up. A few of us crawled to the opening of the shelter, waiting anxiously for any sign of life beyond us. Even though the idea of a rescue was a dream that we had already buried, there was still a spark of hope. We crawled out of the shelter, shielding our eyes from the biting wind. The horizon was white, as always, an empty and desolate landscape. And then, we saw, there were figures moving slowly towards us. At first, I didn't believe it. The cold and tiredness made my vision fail. But little by little, the contours became clearer. They were people, humans. They were Nando and Canessa. They were back. They're back. Someone shouted, and it sounded like the sweetest sound we had ever heard. My legs gave way, and I fell to my knees in the snow, hairs freezing on my face. I couldn't believe what I saw. It seemed like a miracle, something impossible. Nando and Canessa were alive, staggering towards us, covered in snow, their faces marked by cold and exhaustion, but standing. They had returned. I got up with difficulty and ran towards them, or at least I tried. My body barely responded, but what I felt was stronger than any pain. When Ashley reached Nando, I hugged him with all the strength I had left. He was shaking, his face was swollen and pale, his lips were purple, but there was something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. Ashley, we did it, he whispered, his voice hoarse, almost inaudible. We found help. Those words spread among the group like fire in a dry forest. We had been found. The news made the cold disappear for a moment. The hunger, the pain, the despair. All of that dissipated before the prospect that nightmare, was finally ending. How? I asked, trying to understand, still unable to process what was happening. Nando took a deep breath, his eyes filling with emotion. He began to tell about his journey through the mountains. For days, he and Canessa faced snow, wind, altitude, and hunger. Climbing impossible peaks, walking aimlessly in the white expanse, they reached a valley where, finally, they saw shepherds. They were welcomed by people who could hardly believe their story, but who promised immediate help. "They're coming to rescue us," Canessa said, her voice tired but full of certainty. The feeling of relief was so intense that I was at a loss for words. It was hard to believe that the end was near, that the nightmare was finally over. I felt my entire body shiver, no longer from the cold, but from emotion. With every second, the idea that we were going home became more real, more tangible. For the first time in weeks, we allowed ourselves a smile, something we had forgotten how to do. While the wind was still blowing and the snow continued to fall, a new flame ignited within us. We were no longer alone. Nando and Canessa had brought back something that seemed to have disappeared forever. Hope. Just knowing that they had found help and that rescue was on the way brought renewed energy to the group. It was as if a new strength had welled up within us, even in the midst of our absolute exhaustion. We knew we weren't safe yet, but the idea that it was finally over gave us the strength we needed so much. Nando told us that, upon meeting the shepherds in the mountains, he and Canessa were almost unable to speak. They were so weak and that their words were fragmented, interrupted by exhaustion and the cold. The shepherds welcomed them with what little they had, giving them food and shelter. It was there that Nando and Canessa, for the first time in days, were able to rest, knowing that help would soon come. The news that rescue was on the way made everyone around us start moving differently. Those who could barely stand up, like Fido, now made an effort to sit down, to prepare themselves. It was as if the announcement of salvation had awakened a primitive survival instinct, a desire not to give in to death. The days of absolute silence were replaced by murmurs of expectation. Some cried softly, relieved to know that, finally, this could be coming to an end, but rescue would not come immediately. Nando warned us that the mountains surrounding us were treacherous, and the location where the plane had crashed was almost inaccessible. Even for the experienced shepherds who had encountered them, the path to us was dangerous. The authorities had already been notified, but the process of rescuing us would not be quick. We would need to hold out for a few more days. "They're coming," Canessa said, trying to keep us focused. "But it won't be easy. We still need to survive a little longer." Those words, although encouraging, also brought a weight to reality. We knew that even with help on the way, many of us were on the brink of collapse. I looked at Fido, lying in the snow, his breathing shallow and ragged. He no longer had any strength. His body felt like it was giving up, as if he knew the fight was about to end, but he couldn't hold on until the end. Nando knelt beside him, trying to cheer him up. "Hold on tight, Fido, we're almost there. Hold on a little longer." But Fido's eyes were distant, as if he was already preparing himself for the inevitable. Death, which had haunted our camp since the beginning, remained close, even with the promise of rescue. I knew some of us wouldn't have time to see the rescue helicopter land. Physical pain was just one of the struggles we faced. Hunger, although temporarily relieved by what we had done, still tormented us. Every day that passed was a new torture. The cold punished us relentlessly, freezing every inch of our bodies, making even the simplest movements difficult. My hands were numb, my feet didn't respond properly, and the feeling that we might not make it through another night was constant. Looking up at the sky, I saw the dense clouds covering the horizon, like a constant threat. We knew that weather conditions were our biggest enemy now. If the weather worsened, the rescue could be delayed, and more lives would be lost. With each new gust of wind, we felt the weight of uncertainty crushing our hearts. They will find us, I repeated to myself, trying to keep the faith. They have to find us. The following days were a mixture of agony and expectation. Each morning, the first thought upon waking up was whether this would be the day we would hear the sound of helicopter blades. And each night, disillusionment set in more deeply. As rescue did not arrive, the snow fell increasingly heavy, covering everything around us, transforming the scenery into something unreal. It felt like the entire world was dissolving under an impenetrable layer of ice. There were times when I thought we might never be found. That we would stay there, frozen in those mountains, forgotten by the rest of the world. It was difficult to maintain hope when everything around us indicated otherwise. But Nando and Canessa, exhausted and weakened, continued to encourage us to hold on. They had already done the impossible by crossing the mountains, and now they were determined to keep us alive until the end. And then one day, as the sun began to hide behind the mountains, we heard the sound we had been waiting for so long. A distant but unmistakable noise, the sound of a helicopter blades. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, but as it got closer, the sound became stronger, more real. "They are here," someone shouted, and the word spread through the camp like thunder. We scrambled to our feet, fighting the cold and exhaustion, and ran out of shelter. The helicopter appeared on the horizon, cutting through the gray sky like a metal angel from the heavens. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Tears streamed down my face, mixing with the wind and snow. The sound of the propellers echoed in our hearts like the sweetest music we had ever heard. The helicopter hovered above us, its blades kicking up clouds of snow around it. I felt light, as if the weight of all my suffering was being lifted from me in that instant. A rescue party descended, their steady, assured voices contrasting with our fragility. They hugged us, wrapped us in blankets, and helped us board the aircraft. At that moment, I knew we were safe. The nightmare was over. As the helicopter moved away from the mountains, I looked down and saw what we left behind. An icy, desolate landscape where we had fought for our lives. The price we paid was too high, and many of us would never fully recover. But at that moment, all that mattered was that we were alive. As the helicopter flew over the mountains, a mixture of emotions took over me. The rhythmic sound of the propellers hitting the air seemed to lull me, taking me away from that icy hell. Looking out the window, the mountains that once seemed invincible now became small, distant. It was as if, finally, we were leaving behind the nightmare that seemed endless. But I knew deep down that the Andes would never completely leave us. We had been marked by that forever. Nando was sitting next to me, his eyes closed, as if he were silently praying. Canessa, exhausted, tried to warm his hands with a blanket that the rescue team had given us. We were all covered in layers of clothes and blankets, but the cold still lived inside us. It was a cold that didn't just come from the snow and wind of the mountains, but from something deeper, something that only those who had experienced what we experienced could understand. The helicopter landed at a small makeshift base, where a team of doctors and nurses were waiting for us. We were carried one by one, as if we were too frail to walk. In fact, we were. Our bodies were broken, and our spirits, even more so. When my feet hit the ground, I felt heat for the first time in weeks, and it almost made me collapse. The heat felt wrong, almost strange. After so long in the absolute cold of the Andes, we were taken to a tent where doctors began to examine us. The environment was chaotic, but there was an organization in the middle of it all. Several people were talking at the same time, asking for information, asking questions. I remember a doctor holding my wrist, checking my vitals, but everything seemed distant, like I was watching myself from afar, unable to believe it was actually happening. "It's okay, you're safe," he said, with a tired smile, trying to comfort me. But those words sounded unreal. Was I saved? It was hard to believe that after all, I felt trapped between the past and the present, unable to accept that the worst was over. As I lay on a stretcher, memories of the last few months began to invade me in a brutal way. I saw the faces of my friends, the ones we had lost, the ones left behind in the mountains. I saw their bodies, motionless in the snow, frozen, as if at any moment they would stand up and walk back to us. Death was ever present on my mind, and guilt began to creep in, whispering that I shouldn't be there, that I didn't deserve to be alive when so many others had perished. Nando, lying on the stretcher next to me, opened his eyes and looked at me. "We did it, Roberto," he said, his voice weak, but filled with an emotion he couldn't hide. "We are alive," I nodded, but inside I wondered what that really meant. We were alive, yes, but at what cost? What had we done to survive? That question echoed in my mind, a doubt that would torment me for the next few days and, perhaps, for the rest of my life. That night we were taken to a hospital in Santiago. Transport to the city was smooth, but the reception we received upon arrival was overwhelming. Reporters, cameras and flashes were waiting for us as if we were heroes returning from a war. The reality is that we didn't feel like heroes. We felt destroyed, fragments of what we once were. The media wanted to know everything. They wanted the details, they wanted the horror, they wanted the full story, without worrying about what it meant for us. "How did you survive?" was the most frequently asked question, but how could we respond to that? How to explain the endless days of suffering? How can we tell what we did to stay alive? The world wanted answers, but the truth was we didn't know if we were ready to tell them. At the hospital, medical care was intense. I remember nurses moving around me, checking my heartbeat, taking my blood pressure, feeding me small portions of food that, for days, my body rejected. After so long without real food, it was as if my stomach didn't know how to deal with it anymore. Every bite was a struggle. I wanted to eat, I wanted to recover, but my body seemed to have unlearned it. Doctors told us we were malnourished, severely dehydrated, and showing signs of hypothermia. That was no surprise to us. We already knew our bodies were at their limit. But hearing it in clinical terms, as if we were case studies, was disconcerting. We were more than diagnoses, we were survivors. And yet, we were strangers even to ourselves. In the days that followed, some family members began to arrive. Seeing my mother's face, she entered the hospital room was the most surreal moment of my entire life. She looked both radiant and broken, as if she were caught between the happiness of seeing me alive and the pain of knowing what I had been through. His arms wrapped around me, and for the first time since we had been rescued, I cried. "You are here, my son, you are here," she repeated, as if it were a prayer. But I couldn't speak, I'd just cry. The tears that I had held back for so long finally found their way, and with them came the memories, the pain, the images that would not leave me. I knew my mother couldn't understand what I felt, and a part of me was grateful for that. No one who wasn't there would ever understand. The following days were a mix of physical recovery and emotional shock. While our bodies slowly began to function again, our minds remained trapped in the mountains. I wondered if we would ever truly be able to leave that place behind, or if the Andes would always be with us, like a shadow that would follow us wherever we went. However, as difficult as it was, the healing process had begun. We were back to life, or at least trying to find our way back. The journey was still far from over. The days in the hospital passed slowly, dragged on by a mixture of physical and mental exhaustion. With each dawn, I felt a little stronger, but at the same time, further away from everything that seemed normal. We were back to civilized life, surrounded by doctors, nurses and family, but something inside me was trapped in the mountains. It was as if, somehow, a part of me was still there, amidst the snow and cold. Living that nightmare, the questions continued. Reporters surrounded us whenever they could, and even inside the hospital, we were pressured to tell our story. They wanted to know every detail, how we had survived for so long, what we had done to stay alive. People talked about us as if we were a miracle. But for us, there was nothing miraculous about it. What we had done was just survive the way we could, the way desperation demanded. Every time they tried to get us to talk, I felt a lump form in my throat. The memories were too vivid, too painful. At night, when I tried to sleep, The images of my friends' frozen bodies haunted me. I saw Fito's face, lying in the snow, motionless. I remembered when we were all together, full of life, laughing and playing on the plane before the crash. Now most of them were dead, and the weight of their absence was unbearable. They want to know, but they can't understand, Nando said one night, as we lay in the hospital beds. They will never understand what we did there. What if they knew? I asked. What if they knew everything? He was silent for a moment. We knew that, sooner or later, the truth would come out. The extreme circumstances that led us to do the unthinkable. Cannibalism, the act of eating the bodies of our own friends to survive. It was a truth that tormented us and, on some level, shamed us. Even though we knew there was no other choice, the world wouldn't understand. They will judge us, Nando replied, with a deep sigh. But we did what was necessary. These words echoed in my mind. What was needed? As much as I knew he was right, the guilt still gnawed at me. I looked up at the hospital ceiling, trying to find some relief, but all I saw were the mountains, the endless white of the snow, the shadows of what we left behind. What we had done allowed us to stay alive, but I wondered if we would ever be able to forgive ourselves for it. Days passed, and little by little, we were released from the hospital. Our families were there to welcome us, and the reception was a mixture of relief and pain. It was impossible to explain to them what we had experienced, and I realized, with each conversation, that the distance between what we were before the accident and what we were now only increased. I felt the growing disconnection with the world around me. The people around me laughed, celebrated our survival, but inside, I felt empty. Returning to Uruguay was like entering a new nightmare. When we arrived in Montevideo, we were received like national heroes. There was a crowd waiting for us at the airport, cameras and flashes everywhere. I saw people applauding, holding welcome signs. Everyone wanted to see us, touch us, hear our words. But the truth was, I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to see anyone. The noise, the party, the bustle, it all felt wrong. We had come out of a hell of silence and death, and were now in a chaos of lights and sounds. It was unbearable. My mother hugged me at the airport, crying. His arms around me were an anchor, something that tied me to reality, but at the same time, it didn't feel like enough. The love she had for me, the joy of seeing me alive, couldn't erase the pain I carried. Questions came from everywhere, but I didn't know how to answer them. What could I say? I'm so proud of you, my son, she whispered as she hugged me to her chest. You are so strong, but I didn't feel strong. I felt weak, broken inside. What others saw as strength, I saw as desperation. Survive? Yes, but at what cost? I didn't know if I could continue living with the weight of that experience. Every face I saw in the crowd seemed distant, as if I were separated from everyone by an invisible wall. No one there, except the other survivors, knew what we had been through. When Ashley managed to get away from the crowd and was taken home, silence fell. It was a different silence than what we had experienced in the mountains, but it was still heavy. The walls of my house, which had once felt so familiar, were now strange. I felt like I didn't belong there anymore. My mother tried to make me eat, but I could barely lift a fork to my mouth. The food tasted bitter, and my mind kept going back to what we had done to survive. The contrast between the comforts of home and the horror we had experienced was suffocating. The first few days at home were emotional torture. I tried to adjust to the routine, but nothing made sense. The nights were the worst. Every time I closed my eyes, I relived the plane crash, the screams, the relentless cold. The images of my friends' frozen bodies haunted me, and the feeling of guilt became heavier and heavier. One night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard my mother crying on the other side of the wall. She thought I was sleeping, but I couldn't. I knew she was suffering too, trying to deal with everything that had happened, but there were no words that could comfort her. She wanted me to be happy to be alive, but how could I be? Deep down, I knew I was dealing with trauma that would take years to heal if it ever healed at all. The days following my return home were a mix of confusion and isolation. Even though I was surrounded by my family and friends, the feeling of disconnection remained. I knew they were happy that I was alive, but I couldn't share their joy. I couldn't explain to them why I felt the weight of the memories, the constant fear that I would never be able to leave it behind. The people around me treated me, someone who had done something heroic, But for me, there was nothing heroic about surviving at the expense of choices I could never have imagined making. It was like everyone wanted to put me on a pedestal, but at the same time, I felt dirty, unworthy of any praise or admiration. The questions continued, the journalists persisted, and each new report revived the memories of everything we had been through. There was an expectation that, with time, everything would return to normal, that life would follow its natural course. But I knew that normal was forever lost. Nando, Kanessa, and the other survivors were trying to move on, but they were also struggling with their own ghosts. We met every now and then, in discreet meetings, away from the spotlight. On these occasions, the silence between us said more than any words. There was no need to explain what we felt, because we all knew. One night, after weeks of insomnia and constant nightmares, my mother suggested I seek help. She watched me silently, worried, knowing that something inside me was broken. I accepted, more for her than for myself. I started attending sessions with a psychologist, something that initially seemed useless. How could someone who had never been through this help me? How could he understand? In the first consultations, I said little, just the basics. The psychologist was calm, patient, and didn't force me to talk. He seemed to know I was struggling with something I didn't know how to express. I felt vulnerable, as if opening my mouth to tell what had really happened in the mountains would expose me in a way I wasn't ready to deal with. But, little by little, I started to let the words come out. Little by little, I told my story, not as a hero, but as someone who had survived at the cost of unspeakable pain. I remember the moment I finally spoke about cannibalism. My hands shook, and my stomach turned with the simple act of saying those words. I felt shame, guilt, and, at the same time, relief in confessing what for so long seemed like a dirty secret. The psychologist listened to me, without judgment. He told me that what we did was not wrong, that it was a choice made in extreme circumstances, that it was a matter of survival. You were fighting to live, Roberto, he told me, with a calmness that, somehow, brought me comfort. Anyone who was there, in the same conditions, would have done the same. Although his words offered me some relief, the guilt was still there. The process of dealing with what we experienced in the mountains was not something that could be resolved with a few conversations. I knew it would take time, maybe a lifetime. Little by little, I started trying to reintegrate myself into life. I left the house more often, tried to reconnect with old friends, but everything felt different. The laughter that once brought me joy now sounded distant. Everyday conversations, about work, about football, seemed trivial given what we had faced. I felt like no one around me could truly understand what it meant to fight death every day, knowing that at any moment it could take us. Time passed, and eventually the media calmed down. People stopped asking about the horrific details, what we experienced. The story began to turn into a legend, something that was talked about, but from afar. But for us, who were there, nothing was so far away. The invisible scars were still there, reminding us that the past would never be completely left behind. One day, I received a letter from one of the parents of a friend we had lost in the mountains. He thanked me for surviving, for fighting, and for bringing back his son's story. That letter hit me deeply. I didn't know what to answer. How could he thank me? I was one of those who returned, yes, but what about those who stayed behind? The guilt came back with a vengeance, haunting me once again. How can we move forward knowing that so many didn't have that chance? It was then that I realized that perhaps the act of survival was, in itself, a burden, but also a responsibility. I carried with me not only my own story, but the story of everyone who died. I was living proof of their sacrifice, of the desperate fight we had fought together. And somehow it needed to have meaning. I needed to honor his memory, not just by surviving, but by living, really living. That night, after a long time, I finally managed to sleep without nightmares. When I closed my eyes, I didn't see the mountains, nor the frozen bodies of my friends. Instead, I saw the blue sky, felt the warmth of the sun on my face, and for a brief moment, I felt peace. The scars would still be there, I knew, but now there was room for something more. The nightmare had been part of me, but it didn't have to be everything. From that moment on, I decided that the life I had regained would not be wasted. I would live for myself and for those who did not return. Time does not heal all wounds, but it teaches us to live with them. As the months passed, I realized that life continued its course, regardless of what I had experienced in the mountains. The world was moving on, and I needed to find a way to move on with it. The scars I carried were invisible to others, but to me, they were deep. However, I was beginning to understand that surviving wasn't just a physical act, it was also a choice. A choice of how I would deal with the guilt, with the trauma, and how I would give new meaning to my existence. Sessions with the psychologist helped me process what happened, but the real challenge was finding my place in the world again. After living with death for so long, I felt out of place, as if life around me was too light, devoid of the weight I was carrying. The people around me smiled, talked about their plans for the future, but I couldn't do the same. It was as if there was an invisible barrier between me and the rest of the world, a barrier I didn't know how to break down. The first big step came from where I least expected it. One day, I received a call from Knessa, one of my survival companions. He was organizing a meeting between us, the survivors, something discreet, away from the prying eyes of the press or people who just wanted to relive the horror. Nando would also be there, as would some of the others who managed to return. It was a chance to reconnect with those who had gone through the same experiences, people who didn't need explanations, who knew exactly what it meant to have been in the mountains. That night we met in a small house on the outskirts of Montevideo. When I entered, I felt a mixture of relief and tension. Relief at seeing familiar faces, people who had lived through the same hell as me, but also tension, because I knew that those memories were still alive in all of us. We weren't just survivors of a disaster, we were survivors of each other. We had done the unthinkable together, and now we were here, trying to understand what it meant for our lives. "Good to see you, Roberto," said Nando, with a tired smile. "It's good to be here," I replied, and realized it wasn't a lie. In fact, for the first time, being among them gave me a sense of belonging that I hadn't felt since we returned. We didn't need to pretend everything was fine. We didn't have to talk about what happened if we didn't want to. Being there, together, was enough. As the night progressed, conversations flowed naturally. We talked about our lives, about how we were dealing with the return to normality, or lack thereof. Some of us had found ways to move forward, while others were still struggling with guilt and trauma. But through it all, there was a mutual understanding. None of us were alone in that fight. It was Nando who, at a certain point during the night, broke the silence that had settled over our decisions in the mountains. "Have you ever wondered why we're still here?" he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight we all recognize. We all looked at him. We knew what he meant. The question was not about how we survived physically, but about why we were chosen to return. Why us, and not others? Why did some of our friends die so quickly, while others fought for weeks, only to succumb in the end? The injustice of it haunted us. We may never know the answer, Knessa replied, thoughtfully. But I know one thing, we can't let this define us forever. We cannot live in the shadow of the mountains for the rest of our lives. Knessa was right. As much as the Andes had shaped who we were now, as much as the scars of the experience were burned into our hearts, we needed to find a way to live beyond them. We needed to rebuild ourselves, reinvent ourselves, but how? After that meeting, something inside me began to change. Knessa's words echoed in my mind. If I continued living as a shadow of the tragedy, then she would have won. Death, despair, horror, all of this would have prevailed over my life. And I didn't want it to be like that. It was then that I decided I would do something meaningful with my experience. I couldn't change what happened, but I could try to turn that trauma into something positive. I began to get involved with support groups for people facing serious trauma, and I shared my story in a thoughtful way, not to relive the horror, but to show that even in the most extreme circumstances, there is a way to move forward. It wasn't easy to talk about what we experienced, but I realized that every time I did it, I took away some of the power that those memories had over me. I understood that what defines us are not moments of despair, but what we do after them. The Andes Mountains would always be a part of me, but now I wanted them to be just a part, not the whole. I wanted my life to be more than just survival. I started writing, not just for myself, but for others. Writing became a way of processing what happened, of giving voice to the emotions that had been trapped inside me for so long. And through writing, I began to find a new way to live, not as a victim, but as someone who had found a greater purpose in the midst of the chaos. Life continued to follow its course, and little by little, I found my way. There were good days, and there were bad days, but now, I knew I wasn't alone. I knew that pain and trauma were part of who I was, but I also knew that there was more inside me, and that suffering. Little by little, I began to feel something I never imagined possible: gratitude. Gratitude for being alive, for having a second chance, for being able to do something with this life that was given back to me. And most of all, gratitude for my friends, those who survived with me, and those who stayed in the mountains. They would always be with me, as a painful memory and, at the same time, as a source of strength. The Andes transformed us, broke us and, in some ways, also rebuilt us. I had survived, but now, finally, I was beginning to live. Years have passed since we were rescued from the mountains. Sometimes it seems like it was in another life. At others, I feel as if everything happened yesterday. The scars remain, but time has brought a perspective I didn't have before. I realized that even though we can never erase the past, we can learn to live with it and perhaps find a way to make it stronger. What's left of the Andes inside me is different now. The cold still haunts me on some nights, and sometimes I wake up with my heart racing, with the feeling of being surrounded by snow again. But these memories, although painful, no longer crush me. They are part of who I have become, but they do not define everything I am. I no longer live in the shadow of that disaster, and I have found ways to turn trauma into strength, something I never thought possible in the beginning. Getting back to living was a gradual process, full of ups and downs. The memories of the friends we lost, of the moments of despair, will always be with me, but now I see it in a different way. Their sacrifice taught me something profound about the fragility of life and, at the same time, about the human capacity to resist, even in the face of the impossible. Now, I know that the life I have today is, in part, a tribute to them. Every step I take is, in a way, for all of us, for those who stay and those who returned. A few weeks ago, I returned to the mountains, not alone, of course. Nando, Canessa and some other survivors were with me. It was the first time we decided to return to that place, as if we were finally ready to face the ghosts we left there. The trip was full of emotions that are difficult to describe. There was fear, respect, and in some ways a strange kind of reverence for what those mountains represented to us. When we arrived at the exact spot where the plane crashed, everything was different. Nature had closed in on the wreckage, time had covered the physical evidence of our suffering with snow and ice, but somehow the silence there felt lighter now. Maybe because, for the first time, we were at peace with what happened. There was no longer any need to run away from those memories. We held a small ceremony in honor of our friends. We placed flowers in the snow, exchanged a few words, but what struck me most was the silence that followed. It was a moment of communion, not just with the past, but among us, survivors. Nobody needed to say anything. We all knew what that meant. That was the definitive farewell, not only to the nightmare we live, but also to the pain we carried for so long. As I looked at the mountains for the last time, I realized how majestic they were, even after everything they put us through. They had been our greatest enemy, but also the stage where we discovered what we were capable of. For so long, mountains had only represented death to me, but now I saw in them a kind of stark beauty. They remained there, unchanged, while we, who had been broken by them, moved on and transformed. The flight back to Uruguay was uneventful. As I looked out the plane window, I saw the world continue below us: cities, roads, rivers, and I realized that, despite everything, I was happy to be alive. It was a silent happiness, different from the euphoria that many feel after a great achievement. My happiness was more like a deep contentment, an acceptance that life, with all its unpredictability, could still be good. And that I had the right to live it fully, despite everything. When we returned to our country, life resumed its course, but in a lighter way than before. I started working on projects that really mattered to me, supporting people who had experienced trauma, giving talks, sharing what I learned about resistance and resilience. I found that by telling my story, I not only freed myself from the shackles of the past, but also helped others find strength in their own struggles. There was something powerful about turning pain into learning, and that became the legacy I wanted to leave. One day, while walking through the neighborhood where I grew up, I stopped in front of the school where it all began, where we were just young, carefree, dreaming of the future. I looked at the weathered walls, at the rugby pitch that had once been the center of our lives, and a wave of memories hit me. They were no longer painful memories, they were good, from times before the tragedy, before we knew what fate had in store for us. I suddenly felt whole again, not because the trauma was gone, but because I had integrated it into my story. I understood that life is not just a straight line, full of victories and joys. It is full of curves, falls, moments of despair, and it is precisely in these moments that we discover what we are made of. We rise up, even when it seems impossible. Even today, when I look at the sky or feel the cold wind against my face, I think of the mountains. I think about everything I lost, but also everything I gained. And I know that even though the past is always with me, it no longer defines who I am. Surviving is just the beginning. Really living, finding meaning in chaos, that was the biggest lesson I learned from my experience in the Andes. The Andes changed me forever. But now, I know that I am much more than a disaster survivor. I am someone who found, in the midst of pain, a new meaning in life. And so, I move forward, with invisible scars, but with a lighter heart.
If this story captured and moved you, don't forget to like the video, share with those who love intense stories like this, and subscribe to our channel. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing more narratives that will surprise you and stir your emotions. Don't miss the next chapter of this incredible journey.